So, hi everyone. Can everyone hear me well? Good. I'm Valentin Mang. I'm currently finishing up my PhD at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and most of my research revolves around what makes people fall for misinformation and conspiracy theories, and what makes people act on these beliefs. Actually, a lot of my research is very similar to Cecilia's research, which is why I'm glad that today I'm presenting some findings from a project that is a bit different. It takes a different perspective, a social psychological perspective, slightly different from the one we just listened to. Namely, I've been working on a project on what lay people think causes other people's beliefs in misinformation and conspiracy theories, and how these lay attributions of the causes of these beliefs might predict the intentions to correct the people who hold them. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to use the term misbeliefs, which is an umbrella term for beliefs in misinformation and conspiracy theories. And as I said, in this project, we look at what do lay people think causes misbeliefs, and how might that relate to their intentions to, in interpersonal settings, correct the people who hold misbeliefs, correct, quote unquote, misbelievers. Now, what causes misbeliefs in the first place? So here I'm kind of reiterating what has been mentioned in the previous presentation. One part of the picture, speaking in simplistic terms, of what causes misbeliefs are dispositional psychological factors, such as basic personality traits, individual differences in critical thinking, and a second big part of what causes misbeliefs, or what can cause misbeliefs, are social factors. Factors in the media environment, social influence, like the credibility of sources, or social endorsement in social media environments. And there's also some research showing that social media use in general can predict the development of misbeliefs. Now, in this particular project, we're not really interested in what really causes misbeliefs, but what do lay people think causes misbeliefs. And to answer this question, we looked at early social psychological literature on the attributions people make. What do lay people think causes other people's beliefs, attitudes, opinions, and behaviors? And very generally speaking, lay people tend to explain the opinions and beliefs and behaviors of other people in terms of one of two sources. So let's say this is a person holding an opinion, whatever that opinion might be. We as lay people tend to explain the fact that this person holds this opinion in terms of one or two sources in general. Dispositional causes of this opinion, so this might be us thinking that, well, this person holds this opinion because of their personality, because of their deeply rooted values, because of who they are. And then the social and situational causes. So we might think that this person holds this opinion because they were told to endorse this opinion, because they were influenced to believe or to, well, hold this opinion. And a lot of research over the last, well, almost 6 decades has shown that individuals tend to, or lay people tend to put a disproportionate weight on dispositional factors when we try to explain other people's beliefs and attitudes and behaviors. So in general, we tend to underestimate the influence of social factors on people's attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs. We tend to overestimate the impact of dispositional factors. And we do so even when a behavior or an opinion or a belief is clearly situationally constrained. So even when we're told this person holds a certain opinion or endorses a certain opinion because they were told to do so, even then do we overestimate in general the impact of dispositional factors. Why do we do so? Because social factors in many contexts are not very salient. Now, how might that relate to the context of misbeliefs and, more specifically, the act of correcting the people who hold misbeliefs in an interpersonal setting? Social psychological research has shown that when we attribute negative characteristics of other people to dispositional causes rather than social causes, that tends to result in more negative perceptions of these people, and we end up being less likely to, or less willing to help these people. Why is that the case? There is a relatively prevalent lay belief that outcomes that are caused by stable causes, such as someone's psychological dispositions, rather than more malleable causes, like factors in the social environment, are more likely to occur in the future. So in the context of misbeliefs, if I attribute someone's misbeliefs very strongly to dispositional factors that I believe to be relatively stable, I should perceive the act of trying to correct this person as relatively futile because, well, their beliefs are going to be relatively stable over time, so there's not much point in correcting them. So I'll go through a few results from this project. I don't have the time to go through all of it. More specifically, I'm going to go through 3 predictions that we tested. One being that we predicted lay people would attribute other people's misbeliefs more strongly to dispositional than to social factors. Relatively straightforward. Then we also predicted that, in line with what I just mentioned, dispositional attributions of other people's misbeliefs would be negatively correlated with people's intentions to correct the people who hold misbeliefs. And social attributions, so believing that someone's misbeliefs are caused by factors in the social environment, would be more positively associated with correction intentions. So I'll present the results of 5 correlational studies that were almost identical in their design. We had around 1,500 participants overall. The main difference between studies was the misbelief topic we looked at. So in study 1, we looked at misbeliefs around vaccination. In study 2, at misbeliefs around technology. In study 3, misbeliefs around politics. And in study 4, misbeliefs around climate change. In study 5, we looked again at vaccination. Now, in all of these studies, that's an important thing to note, we only included participants who did not endorse the focal misbeliefs. So not the people who hold the misbeliefs themselves, but the people who disagree with the people who hold these misbeliefs. The methods were pretty much identical across studies. We gave people a vignette. We told them, imagine you have a new coworker, and at the end of the week, you go for after-work drinks with your colleagues, and this new coworker engages you and some other coworkers in a conversation about the focal misbelief topic. So in the vaccination studies, for instance, this person starts to say things like, well, I believe vaccines cause autism. Starts to spread misbeliefs in this social interpersonal situation. And then we ask them, what do you think caused these misbeliefs? Sorry, I don't think you can read all of them, but it's not, you don't have to read every word. We asked them, to what extent do you think the following factors contributed to this person's misbeliefs? And we started with one single bipolar item that ranged from only dispositional factors caused this person's misbeliefs to only situational or social factors caused this person's misbeliefs. Then we had 2 more detailed attribution measures where we measured attributions to several dispositional causes, which we averaged into one dispositional attribution score. And then we had 3 items, which we used individually because they didn't correlate really highly, to measure attributions of this person's misbeliefs to different social factors. More specifically, we asked them, to what extent do you think this person's misbeliefs were caused by influence from traditional media, influence from friends and family, and influence from social media? And then we asked them, how likely are you to correct this person in this interpersonal situation? How likely are you to tell them that, well, what they're saying is not supported by facts? How likely are you to correct them to trustworthy sources of information, and so on? Now, looking at the results, let's first look at the prevalence of attributions. I mentioned this single bipolar item that ranged from this person's misbeliefs were only caused by dispositions to they were only caused by social factors. I plotted the results from this item across studies here. On the x-axis, you can see the scores ranging from 0, only dispositional factors caused this person's misbeliefs, to 100, only situational or social factors. And across studies, most of what's happening here is happening on the dispositional side of things. So you can see the black diamonds, they indicate the mean attribution scores. They were all significantly different from kind of the neutral midpoint of the scale, which we took as some evidence that, well, people seem to attribute others' misbeliefs relatively strongly to dispositional causes, which is not too surprising. However, we also had these more detailed attribution measures that are plotted here. So on the y-axis, we have overall attribution scores, and on the x-axis, the different types of detailed attributions, with the green distributions being dispositional attributions, and the other ones being social attributions. And as you can see, across studies, again, dispositional attributions are relatively prevalent. More specifically, they're more prevalent than attributions of this person's misbeliefs to influence from friends and family and influence from traditional media. But by far, the strongest attribution is to influence from social media. Here again, we compared the mean dispositional attribution scores to the mean social attribution scores for each individual item. And as expected, dispositional attributions were much, much stronger than attributions to influence from friends and family and influence from traditional media, but we found the opposite pattern for influence from social media. So by far the strongest attribution that we found was influence from social media. How does this relate to the interpersonal correction of other people's misbeliefs? To find out, we did something relatively simple. We just fit linear models predicting the intentions to correct this person here on the y-axis from attribution scores, on the x-axis from these different types of attributions. The only two that I'm going to focus on are the green line, which is dispositional attribution scores, and the dark red line, social media attribution scores. You remember our prediction that dispositional attributions would be negatively associated with correction intentions. We were really wrong. There was no evidence for that whatsoever. Actually, there's some evidence for positive associations in some of the studies. I'll show you the coefficients in a second. What I found more interesting, though, when you look at the red lines, it seems that there's a relatively consistent positive association between attributions to social media influence and intentions to correct this person. So the more strongly people in our studies attributed this other person's misbeliefs to influence from social media, the more likely they were to correct them. There were some inconsistencies, so as you can see, I highlighted the statistically significant coefficients from the previous plot in bold. You can see there were some inconsistencies, particularly for dispositional attributions. Well, there wasn't really a clear pattern, so what we did was we fit several meta-analyses, internal meta-analyses to our data, one set of meta-analyses for the association between correction intentions and dispositional attributions, and one for correction intentions and social media attributions. As you can see, there's not really consistent evidence for any association of dispositional attributions and correction intentions. If at all, there might be, in some cases, a small positive association. However, what we do find relatively consistent support for is a positive association between social media attributions and correction intentions. Now, what do we make of this? Overall, lay people indeed seem to attribute other people's misbeliefs more strongly to dispositional than social causes, with one big exception. The strongest attribution of other people's misbeliefs that we found was the attribution to influence from social media. This is interesting from a fundamental perspective. It adds some nuance to the social psychological literature on dispositional attributions. It could potentially be explained by the salience of social media influence in the context of misbeliefs. So I found a Pew Research Center survey where they asked people, well, the first question was, do you think social media is good or bad? And if people said, I think social media is bad, they asked them for the reasons why they think social media is bad. And the number one reason, there was a sample of US Americans, a representative sample, the number one reason people mentioned was misinformation. So people seem to have this lay belief that social media is bad for people because of misinformation. So that is one potential reason for why we have found what we found. More interesting, though, I think, is the finding that the more strongly individuals attributed other people's misbeliefs to influence from social media, the stronger their intentions were to correct misbelievers in interpersonal settings. Kind of a logical next step here is, I don't have any data speaking to that yet, but kind of the practical implication of this is, could we potentially increase or foster the interpersonal correction of misbeliefs by fostering these social media attributions, by educating people about the influence of social media on people's misbeliefs, by, for instance, doing more science communication about how social media can shape misbeliefs. So yeah, this is future research. I don't have any data to speak to that yet, but I think it's a potentially interesting kind of perspective on the phenomenon of misbeliefs and provides a potential avenue for how we can fight the spread of misbeliefs, namely not just by conducting classic interventions, but by encouraging the interpersonal correction of misbeliefs in the general population. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have time for now. We have some more findings from these studies and other studies that I'm happy to talk about later. But yeah, that's it for now. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. So I wish I had a good kind of quantifiable answer to that question. I'm not aware of any studies, any papers systematically looking at kind of the magnitude of the impact of dispositional psychological factors influencing misinformation susceptibility and social factors. One thing I do think, though, is that we keep underestimating, not just we as researchers, but also lay people, keep underestimating the impact of social factors. Yeah. Yeah. That is a very good point, and that was also, sorry? Yeah, that's an extremely good point that we also kind of suspected might be driving some of the effects that we found here. More specifically, the two strongest attributions that we find are dispositional attributions and attributions to social media influence. So what if these two just tap into kind of the same thing? If that was the case, we would be expecting a relatively strong correlation between attributions to social media influence and dispositional attributions. I think I actually last minute threw out kind of the extra slide on this particular correlation. The short answer is there is none. So at least in our samples, these two types of attributions don't really correlate at all. In some studies they correlated like 0.1, but it's negligible. So I genuinely do think that they tap into distinct constructs. I think they might. It's a very good point. I absolutely agree. We only looked at 3 different social factors. That's absolutely not an exhaustive list of the factors that shape misbeliefs. But I actually think that the factors that we included are some of the kind of more obvious ones from a lay belief perspective. So I think it would be really interesting to look at attributions to other more complex, more structural social factors, like levels of inequality. There's a lot of research by now showing that economic inequality can increase susceptibility to conspiracy beliefs and to misinformation. I think it would be interesting to look at that as well. But I do suspect, this is just kind of my own lay intuition, I do suspect that attributions to these more structural factors would not be very strong. I don't think that these very structural, more complex social factors are very present in lay people's minds when it comes to thinking about why does this person espouse conspiracy theories or misinformation. Yeah. As for kind of how that would shape correction intentions, I really don't know. But yeah, we kind of started with something, and we're also planning on following up on this in more detail, looking at other factors. But yeah, that's a very good question that we haven't, well, we don't have any data to speak to that yet. I guess it kind of relates back to one of the findings Cecilia presented on how people think other people, thus themselves, are impacted by social cues, essentially. I would actually expect kind of a similar pattern when you ask people about groups versus individuals. I'm not entirely sure though. Yeah. Overwhelmingly, yes. So there's actually this relatively large literature that spans like 6 decades, where similar questions have been asked in different contexts. So asking people, what do you think caused this person to espouse a certain controversial opinion, to behave in a certain way? And across behaviors and contexts, one of the most consistent findings and most replicable findings is that people tend to overwhelmingly attribute others' beliefs and attitudes and behaviors to dispositional factors, which I think is actually why the finding that the strongest attribution we find is an attribution to social media influence is quite striking, because it is something that, well, it intuitively might make sense, at least in retrospect. Admittedly, we also didn't anticipate that, but we would not have predicted that based on this large psychological body of literature. Mm-hmm. Very good question, very good point. One thing right away, I'm not advocating for spreading misinformation ourselves, just to be very, very clear. So it's kind of a tricky question because we also, as I mentioned earlier, we cannot really quantify right now the impact of these different factors. So in the last part of your question, you mentioned that kind of an alternative would be to tackle the inaccurate lay belief that all kinds of other beliefs and attitudes and behaviors are caused by disposition. So we could start with that and correct this inaccurate lay belief. Based on the data we have, I don't think that would be particularly effective, because we don't find a consistent association between, at least when it comes to fostering the interpersonal correction of misbeliefs, because we don't really find a consistent association between these dispositional attributions and correction intentions of misbelievers. I don't necessarily think that we have to tell people, well, social media influence is the only thing that drives misbeliefs. Actually, one of the next steps that I would like to take here is to just show people, summarize the results of a study showing that social media use contributes to the development, or can contribute to the development of misbeliefs, and see if that would be sufficient to kind of make these social media attributions more salient and potentially, in a particular situation, increase interpersonal correction intentions, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?